Hello, my name is Sarah Ospina. I'm Vice President of Portfolio Experience at Workday Ventures. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing you to three extraordinary company leaders who, with their teams, are solving important problems, who are obsessed with building a strong company culture, and who are delivering innovative solutions. Given my role, I'm fortunate enough to engage with these inspirational leaders on a regular basis. Their energy and passion are palpable. Let's get to know these company leaders and the lessons that they've learned along the way. From a housekeeping standpoint, feel free to send over questions. We do have 15 minutes set aside at the end of the session for Q&A. With that, Lindsay, would you please introduce yourself and explain what Wellthy does?
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. I'd be happy to. So I'm Lindsay Jurist-Rosner, and I'm CEO and founder of Wellthy. I always spell Wellthy. So we are actually spelled W-E-L-L-T-H-Y, and we're wellthy.com. And Wellthy is focused on helping families who are dealing with complex, chronic, and ongoing care needs. So think of an individual who has a parent with Alzheimer's, or a child with autism, or a spouse or a sibling with cancer or Parkinson's. Our belief is that it's just way too darn difficult for families to manage and navigate care in the US today. And so Wellthy really helps to relieve the burden of caregiving for families and allows families to be together in a more caring way without the administrative and logistical aspects of care. And so we're sort of like a tech-enabled care concierge, and we work with employers. So companies cover the cost of Wellthy as an employee benefit, and we have the pleasure of working with large companies, the Googles and Facebooks and Accentures and Fidelities of the world, as well as smaller companies, and get a chance to support tens of thousands of families every single day and make a huge difference in their lives. So that's us. Happy to be here.
Yeah, such great concept. And Laura, would you mind introducing yourself and explaining what Sora does?
Of course. So I'm Laura Del Beccaro. I'm co-founder and CEO of Sora, and we help HR and people teams automate and personalize really important HR operations processes, mostly like onboarding and offboarding for employees. We try to automate as much of the tedious administrative pieces as possible, while keeping it a very human experience so that your team can actually spend time with people.
Great. And lastly, Katica, please introduce yourself and explain what Pipeline does.
You bet. My name is Katica Roy. I'm the CEO of Pipeline. Pipeline is a software platform that increases the financial performance of companies through closing the intersectional gender equity gap, gender plus race, ethnicity, and age. We actually started with research. We did a research study across 4,000 companies in 29 countries. And what we found was that for every 10% increase in intersectional gender equity, there's a 1 to 2% increase in revenue. That's what our model is based off of. What we essentially do is ensure that every people decision is both equitable and in the best financial interest of the company.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. So can each of you share the path that brought you to start your own company? And you can start from wherever in your journey, but I would love to hear a little bit about the reason and the path that brought you to start your own company. And Lindsay, why don't we start with you?
Sure, happy to start. So yeah, the founding story of Wellthy is actually based on a personal story of mine. I was a caregiver for my mom for 28 years. I never considered myself a caregiver. I considered myself her daughter, but I was involved in her care in a very intimate and challenging way over nearly 3 decades. So as a kid, it was really helping out around the house. She got diagnosed with primary progressive multiple sclerosis when I was 9. And it was really after college when I moved home and lived at home. I would get her up in the mornings and on and off the toilet and help her with breakfast. And then I would go into the office and I'd sneak home to help her with lunch. And then I'd go back into the office and I'd help her in the evenings. And I did that for years. I made the difficult decision to move out of the house in my later 20s and set up support and infrastructure for her and hired and fired in-home aides. And we went through hospitalizations and surgeries and special treatments And the last year and a half of her life, she was on hospice. And it was through those really 28 years that I became more and more obsessed with the idea of creating a better healthcare experience for families like mine. For the longest time, it was this secret double life that I barely told anyone about. And the eye-opening thing for me was meeting other people with their own version of my story. I hate to say it, but often caregiving is still a women's issue. We see that caregiving is intensified for BIPOC populations. And so in supporting and serving caregivers, there are all sorts of good benefits that come from it. Companies get to support and retain high value employees. It's, these folks who are doing really critical work are getting more support, and that's improving outcomes for their loved ones. And then it's supporting and recognizing unpaid labor that is so valuable to our economy. And so it's a personal founding story that continues to drive me every day. While my mom has passed on, I still find myself in various caregiving roles. I have some kids now and involved in my mother-in-law's care. My grandfather just passed away. So continuing to support and be there for loved ones and lean on my company now and having a better experience. So that's the founding story of Wellthy, Sarah.
Fantastic, yeah, and how your personal experience really informed the innovation of your company. Yeah, remarkable. Laura, could you share about your path and how it brought you to start your own company?
Definitely. So I think mine started a very long time ago when I was a young kid. My dad was actually a CEO and founder his whole life, and he actually had some success from it, and was definitely able to kind of craft his life in a way that was very desirable to me. He was able to come to every soccer game, every tennis match, etc. And so I grew up just thinking I wanted to be a CEO. But when I actually graduated and went into the working world, it wasn't very clear what a path could look like for that. I think I just tried to optimize each step for optionality. So my first job out of school was in consulting. That was very helpful because you meet a lot of different businesses and in different industries, et cetera. And I was thinking it will preserve optionality in case I want to go into any of those industries. And then I found my way into tech. I was living in San Francisco. Took a job as a sales engineer, which I loved because there was still this optionality to either go the technical route into engineering or a more customer-facing route into sales. We got to interface with a ton of different organizations within the company, which I really, really appreciated. And I found myself gravitating toward things that I thought would help me start a company eventually, trying to manage people, trying to learn how to code, et cetera. And eventually I got really great advice from a friend that I should start to just write down 5 problems a day if I wanted to start a company, so that I got my mind in a problem solving kind of state. And they could be completely unsolvable, like there's too much gum on the sidewalk, but I should just get my mind thinking in terms of problems and things that I might be interested in solving. And, at the end of a month, see if any of the problems I wrote down are actually worth exploring. And while all of this was happening, my fiance actually switched into an HR role at his company and started to experience all of the administrative burden that many people teams know way too much about. And so while I was trying so hard to find a problem separately, his problem sort of arose, and it felt like a little bit of a sign to me. And it was very, exciting to kind of dive in and do this thing that I always felt I was meant to do, but never really had the perfect path to do.
Yeah, it's great to hear how you prepared yourself for the opportunity. That's great. Yeah. And Katica, could you spend a little time sharing about your path and what brought you to start your own company, start Pipeline?
Yeah, you bet. So there's 3 pieces. I will go through them quickly.
That's all right. Take your time. Yeah.
One is that, and I'll explain each, but one is that I'm the daughter of an immigrant and a refugee. The second is my place in my family. And then the third is my experience in the corporate world. So I am the daughter of an immigrant and a refugee. My mom was born in 1939, the year that World War II began, on the Channel Isle of Guernsey, which is one of the Channel Isles of the United Kingdom. It is in closer proximity to France than mainland England. And in 1940, when Prime Minister Churchill doubted his ability to defend the Channel Isles, he actually evacuated them. And my mom was the youngest. She was 18 months old. She was the youngest of 5 children, separated from her mother and her 4 siblings, placed into an orphanage and adopted a year later. She would actually emigrate to the United States when she was 21, when she was emancipated for opportunity and equality. That was my mom's story. My father was a refugee. He escaped from Hungary after the fall of the 1956 revolution with my 3 oldest sisters, who were 3, 7, and 8 at the time. With the help of Hungarian freedom fighters, they actually walked across a minefield and arrived to a refugee camp in Austria. And less than 2 months into their stay at the refugee camp, President Eisenhower sent Air Force One to bring 21 Hungarian refugees to the US on Christmas Day, 1956, and they were on that plane. So you can imagine a father going from risking his daughter's lives for freedom to watching them climb the stairs of Air Force One to realize that. And so what I was raised with, and my siblings were raised with as well, particularly the 3 that were born here, was this sense of duty and the opportunity that we had been given to be born in the United States, and that we had an obligation to do something with what had been given to us. That was a core part of why I started Pipeline. The second is that I am the youngest of 6 kids, 5 girls, 1 boy. And if you think about the legacy of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and all of the things that she made possible in her lifetime, so things like women being able to get a credit card without a male cosigner, women being able to get housing without a male cosigner, women being able to get a business loan without a male cosigner, which, by the way, you couldn't do until I was in middle school. All of those things were made, those changes were made in my lifetime. And so as the youngest, what I watched was the lack of economic opportunity impact not only my sisters, but also their children. So I saw that growing up. And then the last piece was my experience in the labor force. I was in the labor force for 23 years before I launched Pipeline 5 years ago. And I'm a breadwinner mom for a family of 4 who fought to be paid equitably twice and won. I did not file a lawsuit, but I was a litigation paralegal. That was my first job out of college. And so I knew how to do legal research and stand up for myself. And what I thought was, why should I have to do this? Like, what shouldn't the companies that I work for actually know that I'm experiencing pay inequity and be proactively notified about that? And how different would that employee experience be if the commitments that companies are making was actually the reality of the employee experience?
Oh, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. I love how each of you, how your own personal experience have informed the path to creating your own company. One thing I wanted to spend some time on was mentorship versus sponsorship. Katica, maybe we'll start with you. Would love to take a few minutes to define the terms, and then would love to go around and hear how have each of you experienced sponsorship and mentorship, one or the other, and how has it impacted your career trajectory? So Katica, why don't we start with you, and then maybe Laura, you can chime in, and Lindsay, and it'd be great to just hear a bit about sponsorship versus mentorship, and again, how it maybe affected your career trajectory.
Yeah, female founders are over-mentored and underfunded. Female professionals in the workplace are over-mentored and under-promoted. So mentorship is great. The issue is that it assumes that the person being mentored, it can, not always, but it can assume that the person being mentored doesn't already have the skills necessary to do the job that they're doing. And the issue becomes, if you are in a system that doesn't value you equitably, which is typically women in the labor force, as well as female founders, because we don't match the pattern of what it looks like to be a successful CEO, either a founder or coming up through the corporate world, we are more likely to be mentored. So it can be a good thing if it's actually about getting you to that next level. Sponsorship is actually about saying you're ready. Like, you are ready, and I am going to bet my reputation and my connections on basically opening that door for you and ensuring that you get the opportunity that you deserve. It is about changing the starting line. We all have different starting lines. That's the difference between equity and equality. And sponsorship is fundamentally about catapulting you forward and changing that starting line. I've had certainly mentors and sponsors in my career. I think one of the most impactful was after I graduated, a couple of years after I graduated from my first master's degree, which was in computer science and behavioral economics. Was a mentor of mine. He was a mentor and then became a sponsor. Actually said to me, you know, Katica, if you want to do anything else, you should probably get an MBA. And I had never really considered getting an MBA. So I went back and got my MBA. And that was certainly someone who made an impact on my life and sort of put that idea forward for me. But definitely, I would say that the second one was when I was in my first master's degree. I had a professor who was published. She published books and published peer-reviewed research, and she was instrumental in one of my papers that I wrote for my master's degree being published in a peer-reviewed journal while I was still in my master's degree. And I think really showed me what was possible for me beyond what I could have seen actually for myself.
That's great. Thank you for sharing.
Laura? Yeah, I think for me, I've known less obviously at the time of mentorship or sponsorship, which one they were, but there's definitely a different feeling that I've had when there was someone willing to fight for me versus there was someone who was sort of, for lack of a better way of describing it, making themselves feel better by like offering me some advice in order to help. So there's definitely a huge difference between those things. And one of the examples that sticks out most is when I was first fundraising for Sora. I was ready for a partner pitch at a given VC firm. And someone I knew who worked there, who was a woman, told me all of these things as I was getting ready, like your pitch should be about 20 minutes, then you should leave this, and it should be in this order, and all of these things that nobody else had ever told me, that I didn't find on the internet at all. And I asked her, like, how does anybody know these things? And she said, well, this is why white men fund white men, because if you already know someone there, who are often white men there, then you get all of this inside information that helps you succeed. And that's how I often think about it, is just like knowing the right person who will give you the right information at the right time and or fight for you, to Katica's point, is unfortunately something we need in order to have a level playing field. So yeah, that example sticks out to me in particular as just like, this is such an obvious thing that doesn't need to be a quiz. Somebody could have just told me this in an email, but I had to know someone in order to get to where I am right now, which is very striking.
Offering the information. Yeah. Lindsay, would love to hear from you.
I love what Laura just shared, and I want to pick up on that concept because I've definitely viewed mentorship. I don't know that I've ever consciously processed whether it was a mentor or sponsor, what the relationship was. I've always thought about it a little bit differently, which is more like having a personal advisory board.
Yeah.
So I sort of at all times have almost a team of folks that I go to on specific topics. Just nobody's going to be an expert on all things that you need kind of guidance or insight on. And so, I do have folks in my life who are exceptional on corporate strategy or marketing or, extensive experience in M&A as we're kind of thinking about various opportunities there. I think the one thing I would encourage folks as they think about their careers is I've gotten a lot less shy about asking for what I need. And so this concept of sponsorship or mentorship, for me, it's really like if I need someone to open a door for me, I've gotten a lot more comfortable just saying, hey, I need you to make this introduction, or will you go do this for me? And I think, generally I've seen women that I've mentored be less comfortable than men. This is overly generalizing with no data. This is like my personal, observation. I do see men more comfortable asking for what they want. Right? Like nothing to lose. Let's just ask. And I've always been more hesitant. And so I've tried to push myself out of my comfort zone over the last bunch of years to just be, and you get a lot of no's, right? Like, no, I don't really know that person. No, I'm not comfortable helping you with that. All right, move on, find someone else. But yeah, that's kind of always how I've thought about it, but invaluable to kind of surround yourself and ask, I ask multiple people the same question. And, it's very helpful, I think, to hear different perspectives, and you find trends and can kind of make your own determinations based off, multiple people's insights. So that's always been my approach. I do the crowdsourcing approach to mentorship.
I like that idea of surrounding yourself with experts. That's good advice. Laura, you touched on this a little bit, but can you share a little bit about the fundraising process as a female, as a woman? How did you navigate the process? I would say it'd be also interesting to hear when did you know to go and raise money for your idea? And then also at a time, if you think about raising additional rounds of capital, how do you think about that as you scale your company? When is the right time to go and seek more capital? And maybe Laura, we'll start with you, and Katica and Lindsay chime in. Again, I just think it's an interesting, and to be looking at it through, obviously, your lens, which is a female founder, woman founder lens, is great.
Totally. So how it plays out as a woman specifically, I can only really speak to anecdotally and from numbers that I've seen, because obviously I only have my own experience from talking to friends who maybe have more privilege in our fundraising. It does seem like there's some difference in the leaps that people are willing to make to believe certain things that you put on a slide. Like, I just get a lot of questions about how exactly I calculated X, Y, and Z, whereas maybe a male counterpart can just put it on the slide and it's taken as a fact. That's the most tactical thing that I think I've noticed as a difference. And there's things like valuation and all kinds of other stuff that comes into play. But overall, I think one of the steps that I was mentioning that got me closer to starting a company eventually was actually that I was a software engineer at a VC firm right before I started Sora. And I went to the VC firm, it was first round capital, because I wanted to get closer to early stage startups and just understand what investors were thinking about and meet people in the investor community at all, and kind of validate for myself that I definitely wanted to do this, understand what kinds of questions people were asking, et cetera. And I think that was just very lucky that I had this experience of watching a ton of companies go through seed fundraising, women, men, people of color, all kinds of people. And I don't think I noticed a ton of differences at First Round. I actually think they do a really great job of trying to serve underrepresented founders, but in general, it helped me so much with, usually when you have X amount of traction, that's when you try to get a seed round. Then all of these seed companies that First Round and my own team was trying to help move through to a Series A process, I was noticing trends around when that was supposed to happen, quote unquote. And this changes all the time. Like, it was very different 2 years ago than it was last year, than it was this year. But there are sort of these rules that probably don't make sense to go through here, but that someone should just write down. Like, you're supposed to have X in ARR and or these kinds of benchmarks in order to raise a Series A. So I think I got lucky with exposure to those sort of unwritten rules in a way. And how I think about it now, and what's helped me the most, I think by far, I've had some amazing rounds of funding and some frankly terrible rounds of funding. Like, one of them was I started in February 2020, and then COVID happened and every VC decided they didn't want to give money anymore. So that was definitely the worst one. I think I got like 50 rejections, just the most rejections I've ever had for anything in my life, and was like the worst month ever. But anyway, I actually think, regardless of COVID being an obvious factor in that fundraise, the biggest thing I've learned by far is that confidence is so important. And when I put these things on the slide, if I am confident in them, and frankly, sometimes I like pump myself up in the mirror and tell myself that to like act like a white guy would when I'm pitching, it actually helps me a lot. And every time, as hard as it is to come from a call where I got rejected to go into a new pitch and act really, really confident, it is the most important thing I've learned by far. And I think it is, in some cases, again, to overgeneralize, one of the big gaps that we unfairly have to make up is that sometimes men just come in with really confident assumptions about their business and confidence that it's going to be a $10 billion business. Frankly, there's all kinds of times when I have no idea if we're going to be a $10 billion business or not, but it's very important during fundraising to convey that confidence that I think a lot of our counterparts do automatically.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Katica, do you want to weigh in on your fundraising?
Okay, so while I agree with that, it's also important that we tell like the truth. Like, female founders are we are discounted. That is the system that we live in. That there is just a natural assumption that we are not as valuable as male founders, whether or not it's conscious or unconscious. That we can have a separate discussion about. And it shows up, so just as one point of data, and I'll share some more. Last year was a blockbuster year for fundraising. Women, female founders, the three of us on this call, got 2% of all the venture dollars. It was set back 5 years in terms of the amount of money that female founders get. And female founders get not only less money to capitalize their business, they also get lower valuations. And what a lower valuation means is that you are retaining less control of your company, as well as less money on the back end when you have a liquidity event. That is, when you either sell your company or you go public. Those two pieces matter. There was a $30 billion gap last year in funding for female founders. And here's the thing about that. We actually outperform male founders in terms of money that's returned to investors, and investors have LPs that actually fund their funds. The money that's coming to us, they have to provide returns for those LPs. Women return twice as much money for the invested capital. That's what, there's a $4.2 trillion gap in returns back to investors because we do not invest in female founders equitably. One of the ways that that shows up is that, and Laura, you alluded to it, is that women get asked prevention questions. That is, How are you going to prevent the downside? How are you going to prevent like COVID-19 when there's an economic downturn? How are you going to prevent new entrants to this? All these different questions versus men get asked promotion questions. That is, how big could this get? How big could you actually grow? So understanding those dynamics and how to actually turn a prevention question into a promotion question is really, really important, because there is a correlation between your ability to do that as a founder and how much money you can raise and at what valuation. That being said, we also need to ensure that the system itself, like one of the things we often do to women is to try and coach them to, and we don't like tell them that at the end of the day, the system does not value you equitably, right? That's like all the training that we give for women to apply for jobs and to change the way they speak, et cetera. Women, there is no, women are not broken. The system is broken. We need to change the system to actually make it more equitable. We certainly see great strides in that. And there's so much more that we need to do to actually ensure equity. And it's not just an issue of fairness. It's actually an issue of massive economic growth for everyone.
Your statistics are fascinating. Yeah. Lindsay, weigh
Yeah,
in on fundraising process for you.
well, listen, I think Katica brings up great points. And I think the good news is I personally have seen a pretty significant shift since the time that we started fundraising, which is about, probably about 6 or 7 years ago, when we raised our seed and we were doing kind of early, friends and family rounds and stuff. There really weren't any women partners at the fund, funds I was talking to. There were very few funds that were focused on underrepresented founders and female founders, and that's changed a lot. So while the numbers, to Katica's point, we're not where we want to be, we are seeing some good signals that we're, there's just a lot more diverse funders, which I think goes to Laura's point about with diverse funders, we'll see more diverse founders. Listen, I've never raised money as a man, so I really don't know how different or if it's harder. I assume it is. I'll share with you, I had a little bit of a low point. So Laura's point about, being able to take that rejection and keep moving with positivity to the next meeting is really good advice. And I definitely had a low moment. We were raising our seed and I got a rejection from a very nice person, very nice man. And I felt the need, I shouldn't have done it, but I did fire back. And I said, no worries. Like, I wasn't expecting that you all would participate, given that you don't fund any other women founders. I looked through your portfolio company on your website and you only fund men. So yeah, I wasn't surprised and I sent the email and then I thought, okay, I shouldn't have done that. There's a little bit of a, yeah, but it was true, right? It was true. And he wrote back and felt the need to defend. And you know what, that little moment of him defending, he went through his portfolio companies and said, well, this one has a female, early founding team member on the executive team, right? Like, so he felt the need to kind of, but if nothing else, I think I hopefully raised awareness with that one individual, but probably didn't do it in the most respectful way. But yeah, listen, what I've seen, so we're Series B going into our Series C, call it in the next year. We've raised about $50 million. And, the biggest thing I noticed is as you become later stage, to Laura's point, it's less about, do I believe you? Potential investors are saying, do I believe this person? And that's where we get into the gut read on people. Like, is this familiar? Is this person familiar? Are they believable? And what I noticed is certainly in our Series B process, it was much more about the metrics. Did we have, high revenue growth? What are the, what's our pipeline? What are the fundamentals? And yes, there's still the aspect of how big can this business go and telling the big hype story and having a lot of confidence with that. But in some ways, for me, it's become a little bit easier as we've grown, because I get to point to like, see, I told you, we did it, right? There's a real business here, and that gives me the pump up and the confidence I need. But it also shows that the promise that I was talking about years ago is, we've delivered on it.
Yeah.
So it starts to change a little bit.
Yeah, that's interesting, that inflection point. Yeah, great. Company culture, we spend a lot of time thinking about and talking about company culture at Workday, and each of us has our own responsibility when it comes to contributing to company culture. As a leader and as the founder, CEO of your companies, how do you think about defining your company culture? And has your company culture changed as your team grows? And if so, maybe a few points on that would be interesting. And Lindsay, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I mean, my biggest so we're now at about 300 people, 280 or so. And we've grown a lot over the last year or two. And so culture has changed. I mean, I think the work we did early on to really kind of think a lot and talk a lot about kind of what it looked like to be a Wellthyian, as we call our team members, who, our mission, our values, our vision, really, solidifying those as an early company, I think was helpful. What we've seen as we've grown is culture, sure, it happens kind of at, I have to help kind of cultivate it and carry it, but it also happens at the team level. So what we've started to see is teams start to take on slightly different versions of the overall Wellthy culture, which is really wonderful and beautiful to see. So I've done a lot of work in the recent months to kind of empower and enable our team leaders, our function leaders, division leaders to really identify and define, kind of how culture kind of might slightly differ, on the engineering team versus on the service team versus on the marketing team. So that's been a really fun journey. But culture, building culture, maintaining culture in a high growth virtual environment is really hard. I've been spending a lot of my time reading and kind of obsessing over this, because a new joiner who joined us, last month has a very different experience joining Wellthy than someone who joined us 3 years ago when we were in person, all in an office together. And so I've started doing a couple things. One is I still do new joiner kind of meetings. I do them kind of batches, right? So we do like roughly 8 to 10 people. Sometimes they're once or twice a week. Sometimes they're every other week. And they're unscripted, no agenda, and just getting a chance to get to know each other and share, talk about the onboarding experience, talk about Wellthy. So I've still been doing that. Second thing is I've started to do weekly emails out to the company. So every Monday I send here's what's going on, here's what's on my mind, here's what happened last week and some exciting updates, and here's what's coming this week. Because what I've found is that Slack and these internal comm channels get very busy, very noisy. Mm-hmm. It's hard to kind of break through the clutter for folks and sort of have folks understand kind of what I'm seeing, what I'm focused on, what we're hearing. So those are two of the things I've been focused on. And then the third thing is just trying to get folks together. We have a whole bunch of people who joined Wellthy through the pandemic who have never met anyone at Wellthy. We think that's really important. So we've been kind of getting teams together and then starting to do kind of gatherings in geographies. And usually they're team member organized lunches, drinks, casual, but just giving people a chance to feel like they're a sense of community and they're getting to know their colleagues. So those are some of the things on my mind, but it is, I'd say, the single biggest area of focus and kind of obsession for me right now.
Great. Okay. Laura, you wanna?
Yeah, I was going to say a very similar thing. I actually think I've talked about this a lot before, but I think culture is the most important thing that a founder can focus on. I believe that if we have a great product, it's because we've built a culture of actually listening to customers and building around that. And if we have a great sales process, it's because we have a culture of collaboration on the sales team where people actually want to help each other in addition to being competitive. And I think that everything positive can stem from a good culture. and that not enough early stage companies focus on it. So I have this framework that I actually wrote in an article recently, and I'm happy to send around, but basically has you evaluate your company based on the words, actions, and behaviors at your company. Because I think the definition of culture is the set of words, actions, and behaviors that a group of people has. And I think, so we try to basically improve upon each of those layers of culture all the time. And we have our entire company evaluate how well we're living up to our values and how well we're communicating with one another, and whether we're being vulnerable about the right things, but not pressuring people to be too vulnerable about other unhealthier things, for example. We talk a lot about how we can instill our values in more of our behaviors, but also how our values could be abused and how we can prevent that kind of behavior. I think that talking about it a lot conveys the importance of it to the rest of our team. I think I talk about it obsessively, to Lindsay's point. And I think that the way each new employee adds to culture is actually a very, very important part of our company in general. And we never talk about culture fit, which we know, first of all, can lead to a lot of bias, and also is just not really a term that makes sense, because nobody should be fitting into the existing culture. They should be adding to it. And to your original point, Sarah, every individual has a responsibility to sort of carry on and add to culture. So we interview for that. We mainly interview for just, do you care about a lot about the culture at a company or not? Not for whether, and of course you should align with our values, but not for whether you would, again, fit into our existing culture, because that's totally irrelevant. There's no point of having a diverse set of employees that bring diverse perspectives if you're asking them to just fit into your existing culture. So yeah, all this to say, I think culture is the most important thing, and have lots and lots of ideas that I could talk for hours about, but we'll leave it there.
Defining it early. Yeah.
Yeah.
Katica, I would love for you to chime in on culture pipeline, just in general. Your views.
Those are, well, yes. And well, I'll talk about culture pipeline and then I'll answer your other question.
Okay.
So the two things that we do at Pipeline, one is Dare to Lead, which is Brene Brown's leadership structure. It's research-based. There's a lot of data to support the way that that's approached and the structural piece. Everyone gets access to that, goes through training as coaching, etc. It's an iterative process. So for instance, we'll talk about marble jar moments, which are putting marbles in the marble jar is trust, taking them out is removing trust. So we'll say, hey, I'm having a marble jar moment with you either way. And if it's a marble jar moment where those marbles are starting to come out, we have what are called rumbles, which are essentially brave conversations about, we might see something very differently, and we're going to talk about that. And so we have an entire structure for that. And that's an expectation not only of me, but it's an expectation of everybody who is on the team. That's the way that we manage all of our structure around culture. In a startup, in any job, you have to be somewhat vulnerable, but in a startup, it is very, very vulnerable, because you have between this raise and some period of time, typically 9 months, depends on where your revenue is, to actually hit KPIs to be able to raise your next amount of funding. So you have to fail fast, and you have to feel comfortable to be able to address those things and then hit the KPIs so that you can keep on going. And so any kind of not being able to have those conversations is not only not okay, it can kill your company. Like it's just, you have to have those conversations. The other thing that we do is our DISC profiles. DISC is a very simple way it's basically a quadrant. It's a 2x2, and so you have introverted and extroverted, task focused and people focused, and so it allows for understanding, and it's simple so people can remember it. Like, I'm a D, somebody else is an I. We're going to have natural conflict in what we value and how we communicate. And so we do DISC assessments of everybody. And then we also give them the tools for actually, if I'm a D, how do I communicate with someone who's an I? And what are those trigger points going to be? And that can also you can put into a rumble. So you can say, like, we're going to have a natural, like I'm a high D. My head of engineering is an S. Those two are natural conflicts. Right? I want to get things done as quickly as possible. We got to go right now. And he wants to make sure everything's perfect, and and they are perfectly suited for the jobs that we're in. And so we have conversations around that, and we have what we call marble jar moments, where you can actually say we have one style is not better than the other. They are all needed for a team to be productive.
I like that. I like that.
I will say one last thing, Sarah, and one is that in the corporate world, and one of the things that we saw, if you're talking about sort of culture and culture add, is that 96% of CEOs are committed to equity, particularly gender equity, and only 22% of employees regularly see it shared and measured. So you have this 74-point gap between what CEOs say is important and the actual employee experience. The actual employee experience is your culture. That is your culture. You can say whatever you want it to be, but that is your culture. And so that's what we really should be focusing on in terms of what does that look like.
Yeah, employee experience. Interesting. Great. Okay, so when you think about your own career, what is one skill that you wish you would have developed sooner? And Lindsay, let's start with you. We'll go Lindsay, Laura, Katica.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I think the most valuable skill I learned that I wish I had developed sooner is sales.
Okay.
You know, as a CEO, I sell all day long to everyone. I'm just selling something to, you know, it's like, I'm pitching Wellthy to potential new hires. I'm pitching Wellthy to potential investors. I'm pitching Wellthy to potential clients. And yeah, I mean, early days of Wellthy, I got pretty tired of listening to myself pitch, you know, but having that skill, you know, and I think being a really good salesperson is being a really good storyteller, being a really, really empathetic, you know, understanding your audience and sort of knowing what version of the story will resonate, and good listening skills, you know, so to pivot the conversation. And so I started my career in marketing, and then I worked for an amazing magazine called The Atlantic, and I sold ad pages in The Atlantic, and you know, literally like carried around a bunch of magazines and went and knocked on the doors of big companies, but it taught me how to sell. And I think that's, yeah, single-handedly my most coveted, you know, skill that I was trained to do, that I use all day, every day.
Interesting. Great. And Laura?
I think it depends so much on what your business might do. I think if I could sum it up, actually, it would be that I was a little too obsessed with all the skills I thought I needed. And actually, one of the most important things has been being able to sift between advice that isn't applicable to me and advice that is, and advice that I want to instead iterate on in my own way. And I think hearing advice from all of us is incredibly helpful, hopefully. But you always need to spin it in your own way and do what makes sense for you based on all the knowledge you're acquiring. And I think that early on, I was very much taking all the advice I'd ever gotten as fact and as this is the best way to do XYZ. And if Stripe says this, then you should do that. And if Google says this, then you should do that. And even when I have really loved a specific piece of advice, we always tweak it a slightly different way to do what makes sense for Sora. And I wish that I had thought about that earlier when I was just trying to like blanket implement different things from different companies. I don't think it hurt us in any way. It's definitely helpful to try things, and you don't need to completely reinvent the wheel, but understanding what pieces of advice are true to you versus not is a very important skill as you go this journey alone.
Yeah, that's it. That's great. Yeah. And Katica, love to hear one skill.
You know, mine would be standing up and speaking out. That's I think that we you know, when we do this particularly to little girls, we tell them, and I have a daughter and a son, we tell them that if they work hard and do well in school, they can be anything they want to be. And it's super well intended. And it's not true. Because we set them up for a world that does not value them equitably, rather than giving them the tools to understand when something is inequitable, and then the tools to speak up. I'll give you a couple of examples, mostly from being a mom, but also from things that I learned myself. I will tell you, the first time I heard, and this is not to call out any men, but the first time I heard the word mansplaining, I was like, oh my gosh, that is what's happening. I would sit, I mean, I graduated summa cum laude and magna cum laude. I would sit in men's offices and think, why are they explaining this to me? Why don't they think I know this? And then when I heard that word, I was like, oh, that's what it is. I have a daughter, she's 11, and my son is older, he's 14. And when she was little, people would compliment her on how she looked. And first I did it, and then I taught her to do this. And she would say, and I'm smart too. And the reason why I did that is I did not want her to be raised with her value in how she looks. I wanted her to be raised with her value. And when she hears herself complimented for how she looks, that she pivots that to how smart she is. And she naturally will do that. The other thing, when she was a little bit older, that I raised her with, and she does this without even thinking now, is that her words matter and she should not be interrupted. So if she is speaking and somebody interrupts her, she says, excuse me, I'm speaking. And she's 11. And so she understands that people will interrupt her, and she has the tools to actually speak up when they do.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I've got one last question. I think we're going to move to Q&A after this one last question, but I will ask this. So what drives you outside of work? And then would also love to hear, you know, what is your reaction when you're asked the question about how you handle work-life balance? Is there such a thing? And why does this seem to be a question that many women seem to receive? So again, what drives you outside of work? And then why don't we talk a little bit about, is there such a thing of work-life balance, in your opinion? And are these type of questions oftentimes targeted towards women? Do you hear these same type of questions being received by men? And Katica, I'm going to start with you.
I was like, are you going to leave? Either way, it's fine. They are more targeted toward women. That is data driven. It's not just my opinion. I have been asked, and my experience is also that I have been asked either, how are you an executive and a mom? Or how are you a female founder and a mom, with the implication being that you can't do both. And there's only one definition of what it means to be a good mom. And what's interesting, when I started Pipeline 5 years ago, my kids were about the same age as when Barack Obama ran for president. And nobody asked him that question, because they assumed that Michelle was actually taking care of Malia and Sasha, right? And so this work-life balance does not exist. It is a polarity, which means that you will sometimes lean on focusing more on your life and sometimes on your work. That is just a given. The other thing that I would say from my experience is that we need to redefine what it means to be a good mom. If you're talking about it specifically around moms, it's not the only conversation, but it's certainly one of them. My husband is a stay-at-home dad and has been for the majority of my children's lives since my son was a year old. And they have never once questioned that I don't make their lunches. They actually, my daughter just got home from school, that I don't take them to school. I don't pick them up from school. But my kids know how to negotiate. My kids know how to stand up for themselves. And I have specifically like carved out, like Saturday is my day with my kids. I rarely travel. I rarely do anything else. And they have never thought, oh, we don't have as much mom as somebody else. In fact, when my son was in preschool, his friend whose mom was a stay-at-home mom said, how come dad doesn't take me to school? Henry's dad takes him to school. Here's the other thing about that, and I will just talk about this specifically around moms in particular. It's not only moms, but the mommy bias, mommy tracking actually happens to women whether or not you have kids, if you are of childbearing age, which is that we assume that women are less committed to their work because they're moms or because they might be moms. That's actually not what the data shows. What the data shows is that working mothers, and by the way, all moms work, not all moms get paid, but moms in the labor force, in the paid labor force, are actually the most productive employees over the course of their career. So if you want to place a bet on any type of employee, you should place it on working mothers who are participating in the female labor force. The last piece I will say is this. We often think that women's income, it's the myth of secondary income, is for purses and shoes. That it's not for things like housing and healthcare and food and et cetera. Here's what is true in the US labor force. Women are the breadwinners in 40% of US households with children under the age of 18. There are 16 million breadwinner moms in the United States. They support 28 million children. So this idea that we can choose not to work is actually not true for the majority of American families.
Interesting statistics. And I've heard Laura and Lindsay, please chime in as well. Lindsay or Laura, starts. You go first.
Yeah. So I do get this question all the time. And I think it's a healthy discussion that everyone should have that shouldn't be centered around women. It's just like, to Katica's point, what percentage of your headspace are you devoting to a given thing at a given time? And it is in flux constantly for both women and men and anyone else. I think, for example, I worked way more hours at my very first job when I was like 22 years old. And I am way more burnt out right this second than I was at that time, because the mental overload is absolutely insane. The emotional overload is absolutely insane. There's no balance at all. And that's okay with me. I'm striving for healthiness in my life. And I talked to a coach about this, and I talked to a therapist about this, and I'm striving for acceptance about certain things. And I'm definitely working on a million things related to my life, but balance isn't really the way I define one of the things I'm working toward. It's just whether I'm happy and satisfied with whatever I've chosen to focus on. Yeah. Separately, you'd asked what motivates you in general. I think for me, and it's somewhat related to a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, I've had this chip on my shoulder since I was 5 to prove that girls could do things that boys could do. And I think I started to receive a lot of the types of comments that Katica was talking about, where we tell 5-year-old girls that it was surprising that I was good at math. And the way that I happened to luckily interpret it was like, oh, I don't know, it just fueled my hate fire, I think. And I just wanted to prove to everyone that I was going to be the best at math and the best at sports and these things that women stereotypically weren't supposed to do. To circle all the way back to the first question, I think it's also a big part of my founder journey was like that chip on my shoulder and improving myself to people. And another fun fact is that to this day, if I've had a couple drinks, I challenge men to a race in the street. And I love nothing more than like beating a man at a race, because it's something they think there's no chance that I can do. So it's a big, big part of my life in general. Part of what motivates me when I am very down about Sora is that sort of like competitive spirit that I happen to have. But I think a big inflection point for me in my career was understanding that not everyone works like that. It's a kind of like lucky personality trait that I have that happens to make me want to achieve X, Y, and Z. And it doesn't make me better than anyone else in any way, but it means that the vast majority of 5-year-olds, when they hear that, are actually discouraged, and that's terrible. And that's why I think the stuff Katica does with her kids that is amazing, and I will be copying all of that. But anyway, yeah, I think agreed with a lot of the things discussed. You have to find what drives you. You have to find what balance or general focus you think makes sense for you at your given stage. It is also totally fine if that means you want to take a break from work, or if that means you don't want to have kids, or whatever that means for you. That I think is the most important thing that I've taken away from my experiences. Whether society defines it for you, or the fact that society defines it for you is the problem. You defining it is the most feminist thing that you can do.
That's great. And Lindsay?
I love all these answers. So thoughtful. I mean, listen, I just feel tremendously lucky that I get to choose. Listen, I've chosen the life that I have. I've chosen to build this company. I've chosen to be in a marriage. I've chosen to have my kids. We are very lucky and fortunate to get the question of how do we find balance, because at Wellthy, we support women every day who don't have that luxury, right? Single moms who have kids at home and are taking care of parents and working in various roles, and they don't have the luxury of a hybrid lifestyle. And so I don't know what balance is. I have no idea what balance is. I mean, at this chapter in my life, I optimize for my company, I optimize for my family, and that's kind of all I can manage. Not particularly good at seeing friends or working out at the moment. I'm very good at drinking wine. But there are different chapters, in my 20s, I'm 41. In my 20s, I was really into being social and, spending a lot of time with my friends and going out. And so I don't know, I think, each chapter of life, you optimize for different things that if you're lucky enough to have, if you're fortunate enough to be able to choose and optimize, then I think that's the way to do it. That would be my guidance. I'm very content to have my very boring life. I have 4 kids. I have a mother-in-law who were involved in her care. And it's that takes a lot, and building Wellthy and putting all of my love and energy into Wellthy, it takes a lot. And so sort of optimize for those 2 things and hope my friends stick around to see me in my 50s. That's my goal. And they do, I have, people understand, everybody's doing their own thing. So I don't know that this concept of balance, I think Katica said it, I think it's not a real concept. Just do you and optimize and do the best you can. And you're going to create some boundaries and choose some things and choose not to do some things. And I think that's okay. Funny, to your question of, do I get asked that a lot? I actually don't get asked the work-life balance question that much. I think it's maybe, I don't know, maybe people just don't care that much anymore. It seemed like it was more of a topic, more of a question pre-pandemic. I think in this pandemic world, the whole concept of work-life balance is kind of bizarre anyway. So
gone out the window. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, good. I am so grateful for your transparency and willingness to be honest with your journey and share about your journey. All three of you are brave and courageous leaders. And I hope the audience feels inspired and energized hearing your story. And with that, let's open it up for questions. I think we only have 10 minutes. So Erin is moderating questions, and maybe Erin, you can, if there's any that rolled in, you can fire them away.
Sure. I have really enjoyed all the conversation, by the way. I've just been sitting here like laughing and smiling and shaking my head. But so the first question was actually about work-life balance, which I think we've since answered. So we will move on from that one. And then next one is for Laura. Does your background in engineering inform how you lead your company?
Good question. I think it helps me, it helped me in thinking about my current job. So when I joined an engineering team was the first time that I couldn't just do what I said I was going to do at the time that I said I was going to do it. Before that, I continue to be obsessed with my to-do list. I like to be on time. I like to do things as fast as possible. I'm probably a D, though I don't know my DISC score. I was just very type A about all of these things. And when I joined an engineering team, there are so many unknowns that are thrown into an equation, and you just cannot understand the entire code base. You don't know exactly how any problem is going to be solved. That mindset is absolutely what you need to take when you're starting a company. Like, you have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow. You probably have no idea really what happened yesterday and how you should be processing that. And so it was an interesting transition at the time. I had to let go of obsession with everything going according to plan. And that has been very, very valuable to me. I think that's probably the best example I can give of how it's affected me. I also think it affects me when I'm fundraising, though, going back to that. Being a technical co-founder that's a woman, it feels particularly rare. In some cases, I think it's helped me. In other cases, I think it's hurt me, as with most things.
That's great. Thank you. Oh, there's one that just came in. So Hollywood has had a major focus on founder stories. We Crashed, The Dropout, Super Pumped as of late. Laura and Lindsay mentioned the need to have people believe you during the funding process. Can you share more about how you viewed the public's interest and response to tech founders?
I have some thoughts on this. I can jump in.
Also divided by gender, because there's a heck of a lot of takedown stories for female founders for really nascent things.
Totally. So I think when I first heard Elizabeth Holmes' story, I was thinking, oh yeah, we all say things to investors when we're pitching that are talking about our vision. And then there's always a point in the story where they clearly crossed a line. Like, she started lying to actual patients receiving medical advice from their company. It's just like a very obvious line. And the line was probably way before that, actually, when she was straight up lying to investors. But I do think that the public, for example, in one of the documentaries, it was like made this big point that she had employees sign NDAs. That's like not that big a deal. Plenty of companies sign NDAs. There's like a lot of things that the public is like, oh my God, about, that I think are a little bit silly. I don't think that it has affected me and my day-to-day and my fundraising processes at all. I don't think anyway, anecdotally, that anybody like thinks I'm the next Elizabeth Holmes, I hope. But yeah, it is a fascinating thing that Hollywood is very into these things.
I had an early fundraising experience. It was right around the time that Elizabeth Holmes, I was fundraising kind of as, early days. I was like seed or pre-seed, right? Just, where Elizabeth Holmes, like front page of the Wall Street Journal, like, companies worth hundreds of millions, changing the world. And then, pretty soon after, the kind of the fall from grace. And I did have a couple of moments that were really concerning. I had one of my investors, I went to catch up with an investor who had invested in Wellthy. And I guess his team had invested, and he was, it was a corporate like a strategic. And the woman who invested was a big believer. And I went in to meet her CEO. And he said, "How do I know that you're not another Elizabeth Holmes?" And I remembered being so stunned, because I have a healthcare company, and I was a healthcare company, and maybe I was even wearing black that day. I don't even know. And it was right around that time. And I remember walking out of that meeting and I cried, not a crier, but I was like so frustrated. I sort of didn't know what to do with my emotions. And this was like an investor of mine. So it definitely came up for me a couple of times with Elizabeth Holmes, and especially kind of through the time that I was fundraising as a healthcare investor, a healthcare founder. And then I've seen a couple of friends, fellow women founders, get taken down. And to be honest with you, my response is I am as boring and as transparent. Like, it makes me think about it, right? Like, I'm like, what will the take, what could the takedown story about me and Wellthy be? And how do I ensure that we are buttoned up beyond belief so I never have to endure that? So it's that's like a real thing that I think about as a female founder, for sure.
There's a really good webinar that was done a couple of years ago. It's Kara Swisher and Jessica Lesson from The Information. You can get it online, about the takedown of female founders and some of what happens because Elizabeth Holmes is certainly the most well-known, but she's not the only one. So I would definitely encourage that. And I think the other piece, Lindsay, I'll add on, and then to what you said, and also I think there's another piece of that. Christine Lagarde, who is the head of the European Central Bank and previously the International Monetary Fund, talked about how women, just to get to the same place, have to be that much better. And so I think that's one for us to be aware of. But the second is to not, and this is, I would say, I knew this before I founded Pipeline, and I certainly have learned it even more so in my last 5 years of Pipeline, which is to not participate in the gaslighting of me. Like, not to believe what people will, right now, for years, for centuries have believed about women, which is that we're just not as good as male founders. And that's not what the data says. And so to not participate in my own gaslighting. And that has been definitely something that has allowed me to walk on my own 2 feet, whether or not people like me and whether or not they like what I say, and to just keep going.
I think that's a great place to wrap. Sarah, you want to close?
No, I was going to say the same thing. Again, thank you, all 3 of you, for being here. You're an inspiration to so many women, and we wish you all the best in each of your companies, and just cheering you on from the sideline. So thank you, really appreciate it. And I hope the audience felt inspired and energized from it.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much.
It's wonderful. Bye.
Bye.